Hello, добрий день, добрий вечір, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. This is Vitaly Chernetsky. I am the president of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US and professor at the University of Kansas. And it is my honor to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part of the event series that our society hosts. I encourage everyone to follow our society through its website, shevchenko.org, and follow it on social media like Instagram and Facebook, where we post notes about events and other important information. For those of you who plan to be next week at the ACES convention in Washington, do not miss the events that we co-sponsor and the reception that we will be holding on Friday evening. For those of you in Philadelphia, please do not miss the lecture by Professor Serhiy Plokhy from Harvard that is sponsored by the Philadelphia chapter of our society. And for those in New York, our next in-person event will be on December 6th. It will be a lecture by Professor Igor Lilyo, a food historian who is currently a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Kansas. We always, at this time of the year, think of the very serious and tragic event that all of Ukrainians and all friends of Ukraine commemorate, which is the genocidal famine known as Holodomor. It is always marked in late November, so next week, as this coincides with the ACES convention, we're holding our public event this time a little earlier. And we are offering you a webinar panel of some of the leading scholars of the younger generation working on these and related topics. And it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's webinar, Professor Catherine Wanner, who is a professor at Pennsylvania State University and is the learned secretary of our society. Kathy, Professor Wanner, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vitaly, and welcome to everyone who is joining us for this memorable event. I'm very pleased to say that we have three quite exceptionally talented young historians who focus on the Holodomor. I think they bring, really, as the title of this webinar suggests, new perspectives. So I would encourage people who have questions to please place them in the Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A, and if you could just place questions there, I will read them as they come in, and our panelists will address them. This promises to be a very interesting and memorable event. I'll introduce each of the speakers before they give their presentation, and we will start today with Iryna Skubii. We are particularly lucky because she is usually in Australia. She is the inaugural Mykola Zerov Fellow in Ukrainian Studies at the University of Melbourne. She holds a PhD from Queen's University in Kingston, where she is right now, which is what enables her to join us. She's also has a candidate of science degree from Kharkiv's Karazin National University. She's the author of Trade in Kharkiv in the Years of NEP, Economy and Everyday Life, 1921 to 1929, which came out in 2017. Her article on food waste and survival practices during the Soviet famines in Ukraine received the Best Article Prize from the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. Her current research explores the global history of sunflowers in Ukraine, and she's currently preparing 2 book manuscripts, which I think is tremendously ambitious. One is on survival, environment, and material culture during the Soviet famines, and another is on the history of consumption in early Soviet Ukraine. The title of her presentation today is Our Village Was Also Helped by Nature, Remembering Survival in the Holodomor. Please join me in welcoming Iryna Skubii.
Thank you so much, Professor Wanner. Thank you so much, Professor Chernetsky, for this kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those who are joining us from Australia. Thank you very much again for inviting Shevchenko Scientific Society and to be able to commemorate the Holodomor today and share some of the results of my recent research. And on this point, I will share my screen and hope that you will be able to see it now. I would like to start by saying that famine does not emerge in the vacuum, but takes place in specific political, social, and natural environments where all elements are intertwined. The acknowledgement of the importance of place and place-based knowledge should also be central for studies on the history of Soviet famines in Ukraine. Challenging the colonial systems of knowledge production is important to allow to speak place for itself. And thus, in my talk today, I would like to highlight in particular why it is important to focus on land, on space. And in my short presentation today, I would like to speak about the place, land, and nature that stood at the very center of human survival during the Holodomor and other Soviet famines in Ukraine. Our village was also helped by nature. This phrase from the Holodomor survivor testimony illustrates how the famine was both experienced and remembered. And today I would like to highlight how the history of the Holodomor could be studied from the ground level, literally from the land, the soil, and the plants. And on this slide in particular, you can see how one of the famine survivors, son of Nikolai Bakan, is pictured sitting in the field on the spot where his brother Konstantin had died in 1933 in Baturin in Chernihiv region. And so many images like this were pictured at the time. When I started working and thinking about this topic, I came across many similar survival testimonies where they stressed on the importance of nature in their survival practices. And depending where these survivors were coming from, either from the steppe regions, semi-steppe regions, forests in the north of Ukraine, or they were living by the Azov or the Black Sea in the south, they would acknowledge that nature was saving their life. And at that time, I started asking myself questions, which you can see on the slide. Is there a place for the environment in the history of famines? And if yes, how did the environment impact or empower human practices of survival and human relationship with food and resources around them? What could the history of land, animals, plants that are part of the ecosystem and human environmental relations during the Holodomor reveal about the famine, about the specific of Soviet famine in Ukraine in particular? And also, what does it tell us about historical events of extreme survival more broadly? And also looking from this perspective, I think we can also ask ourselves as researchers how we can produce a shared history of famine as a catastrophe, as this, that it is interconnected and mutual dependent, where we can see how at the same time people are surviving the famine and so as their domestic animals in particular. And lastly, what does looking from the ground level, if we can name this approach, tell us about Soviet history and the history of famines globally? So looking from these perspectives and asking these questions while I was looking through the sources, first of all, testimonies of famine survivors, I specifically decided to focus on plants, animals, in my research in order to highlight these connections with environment and its importance for survival practices during the famines. Starting with the plants were essential for the survival of the Soviet famines. And on this slide, you can see a number of different wild plants that were common, and they were often mentioned in survivors' testimonies. Burdock, dandelion, knotgrass, goosefoot, or nettles were among the most common plants that I came across in survival testimonies. And one of them, burdock in particular, was among the plants which amazed me most of all, because this plant was quite big, as you can see on this photo, around meter high, with dozens of flowers, which by the end of the season in summer were getting dried by sun and wind. As numerous famine eyewitnesses of the time recalled, at the end of winter or early spring, in particular during the most harsh winter of 1933, they often used dried flowers of burdock, and those seeds were consumed by the starving. But as it appeared afterwards, they got poisoned and died. However, bringing the plants into the history of the Holodomor, we this why have to be aware that eating uncommon plants during the famine was not only a major source of survival, but also a source of poisoning and lethal consequences. And one of the most common type of food poisoning, in addition to wild seeds, as I just mentioned, was also consumption of spoiled grain. On the left side of the slide, you can see how the spoiled grain looked like. And during 1920s and 1930s, we published quite a lot of studies about the disease caused by eating of spoiled grain called ergotism. This plant disease is caused by sclerotia and its pathogens, which has been a common problem for grain crops since 19th century, at least when it was documented. And during the famine of 1932-33, the death records illustrate that one of the most common causes of food poisoning was specifically this pathogen, ergot fungus, which registered in almost every famished region in Soviet Ukraine. Besides the toxic poisoned grain, some plants, and to be exact, their seeds, were widespread cause of poisoning. As I just mentioned, burdock seed were in particular the most dangerous, I would say, for famine survivors, because its seeds have had a sweet taste, and when there were documented cases when peasants would make pancakes made of burdock seeds, and then because they tasted sweet, they ate them a lot and then got poisoned and died. In February 1933, 15 people died of poisoning by eating these pancakes, and this was documented in the report of the PU. Also, it should be said that in this regard, when studying plants as survival resources, we need to understand that plants were bringing not only food for survival, but also they were bringing danger. And that's why scholars should be attentive to the negative effects associated with consumption of uncommon food during survival experiences of the starving. Also, I would like to highlight that one of the important object of study in this regard should be non-human animals, because during the famines, the deterioration of economic and environmental condition in rural and urban areas had dramatic consequences for both people and animals. And also, we know the history of famines as usually presented as human catastrophe, as the impact of famines on animals is equally profound. And this was in particular relevant to the famine of 1932-33, the Holodomor, because it was associated with collectivization, which resulted in mass confiscation of grain and fodder, which was used for feeding animals. And that's why not only people were starving from malnutrition, but also their animals. Similarly, like humans, animals suffered from hunger, while at the same time they also were physically exploited. They continued to be used as labor force in the fields, in the household. They were also slaughtered and consumed en masse by humans who didn't have enough food and decided to eat their horses in particular instead. So reporting on the situation in the countryside during the famine of 1932-33, as the Ukrainian local authorities acknowledged there were some problem. All dogs and cats are killed and eaten, and dogs are stolen by people from each other. The state inspections of the collective farms market also revealed numerous cases when people sold meatballs made of dogs' meat. And also similar cases were documented during the previous and consequent famine of in 1920s and late 40s, when people were eating stray dogs and they disappeared from the street. One of the rare examples in the diary of a teacher from Kharkiv, Alexandra Radchenko, whose quote you can see on the bottom of the slide. In 1933, she wrote about her ambivalent feelings of feeding her hunting dog, while many people around her were starving. Consequently, she gave away her dog to a starving peasant who came to her in search for help. Similarly, but even to a harsher extent, wild animals were significantly impacted by the Holodomor, as they became a common source of food among starving peasants. Gophers, groundhogs, hedgehogs, mice, and other small wild animals, including birds, fish, mussels, were the crucial sources of human survival. And if looking more attentively at the survivors' testimonies, we can see literally many of such smaller kinds of wild animals eaten en masse during the famine. In particular, this fate was related to gophers, who usually resided in the steppe and semi-steppe areas, which were impacted by the famine, and gophers were killed there en masse. In 1932-33, as one of the famine eyewitnesses recalled, a group of 2 boys could catch around 10-15 gophers at once, while a group of 3 people, 2 children and adults, were able to catch around 100 gophers per day. So you can imagine how many gophers or smaller wild animals were caught by starving people in order to survive, and what was the impact of famine on animals. So in this regard, I suggest to consider famines as shared multi-species catastrophe. Taking a critical overview of these histories of more than human loss, human-animal, human-plant relationships, help us not only to amplify and explain the enormity of human sufferings on a daily basis, but also highlight the enriching impact of famines as historical events, as well as state policies, decisions, and inactions that caused them. So in this case, we are not excluding also the role of state, but we are highlighting the consequences of state policies regarding the famine and human practices at the time. By incorporating the perspectives of non-human animals, plants, and place-based knowledge, this approach invites us to reflect on the famines in Ukraine, Europe, Eurasia, and globally. This approach certainly could be applied to a study of other famines. As cruel products of modernity, which were largely caused by the genocidal and inefficient policies of the Soviet state, the communist famines and the Holodomor in particular became much more than human survival crisis and should be considered as multi-species catastrophe. Also, I would like to highlight that these are not only stories about animals, but also about humans and their survival practices. By examining human-animal relationship during the famines, we can clearly see how much such experiences intensified the role of individual agency. The deepening of human relationship with the environment under conditions of extreme food scarcity became an essential component of survival practices. as the hungry develop more informed, knowledgeable, and resourceful behavior. And looking at the history of famine survival practices across different decades, in particular looking at the first half of the 20th century and 3 Soviet famines, we can see how this practices of survival and usage of natural resources were passed down from one generation of Ukrainian residents of Ukrainian Republic to another. Also, I would like to highlight that this approach should also be seen as a sensitive approach to famine studies, because it allows us to see the enormity of suffering of all human species during the famines. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Iryna, for that wonderful presentation. Our next speaker will be John Vsetecka, who is an assistant professor of history at Novo Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. His research and writing focus on the history of famine, mass violence, and transitional justice. He's currently completing his first book, which is entitled In the Wake of Hunger, Confronting the Legacies of the 1932-33 Holodomor in Soviet Ukraine during the 1930s. He's also co-editor, together with our next speaker, Daria Mattingly, of a book which is coming out next month, I believe, entitled The Holodomor in Global Perspective, How the Famine in Ukraine Shaped the World. So I'm looking forward to reading that personally. John is also the founder of H Ukraine, which is a listserv that promotes academic and scholarly content related to the study of Ukraine. The title of his presentation today is The Holodomor as Current History, Russian Disinformation about the Holodomor as Part of its Historical War Against Ukraine. Thank you, John. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kathy. Let me share my screen here, make sure I can get this going. Can you see it okay? Perfect. Well, thanks so much to Kathy and to Vitaly and to all of Intisha for the invitation to speak today. It's always a pleasure to be with these panelists, but particularly with Iryna and Daria, both colleagues, but also, if I may say, good friends. We've sort of grown up in the academic world together, particularly in our sort of young Holodomor scholar group. So I'm very thankful to be a part of this today. Now, excuse me. Today, I want to sort of take a little bit of a departure from my research, which is about sort of how people confront the early legacies and aftermath of famine, but particularly the Holodomor. And instead, I thought it would be apt this year to talk about disinformation narratives that are perpetrated by the Russian state and by their media and social media and pseudo-academic discourse that has sort of attacked the narrative and the history of the famine from really the 1930s until the present. And this is based on a forthcoming book chapter that I was sort of tasked with writing, and I want to thank Olya Bertelsen for the task, which is a forthcoming chapter titled A Common Famine, A Common Past, Russian Disinformation about the Holodomor as part of its historical war on Ukraine. And in this sort of chapter and in my thinking, in watching the sort of disinformation narratives unfold over the past few years, but especially since 2022, but really since 2014, and that's what I'll sort of focus on today, 2014 to the present. I've been curious in the sort of examination of the denial tactics that Russia uses to not only outright deny, but downplay and misinform and disinform, right? The history of the Holodomor, and to discredit the history of the famine and knowledge production about it. And one thing that I'm struck by, and I want to sort of give a shout out to our Ukrainian colleagues who have done fantastic research on this, particularly Andrei Kozitsky, who wrote, I think, what is the preeminent book, and it's unfortunately only in Ukrainian for now, on the sort of long-term implications, in which he outlines the sort of very detailed responses of the Russian sort of disinformation narratives that they, apply to every aspect of the Holodomor over the course of time. And it's a really good book, and I hope that there will be an English publication of this soon. Now, in my talk today, I'm going to be focusing a little bit just more specifically about the role of disinformation as part of the sort of larger history of war against Ukraine, both the sort of physical, which I'll talk about at the end, but also the sort of intellectual and historical war that Russia has been sort of hell-bent on waging against Ukraine. And I'll talk a little bit about the method that I think is very useful for understanding this, called the fire hose of falsehoods, a method that Russia relies on to sort of distort and constantly pump into the media narratives about the Holodomor that are sort of hard to follow and understand whether they're true or semi-true or completely false. So what I will claim today, and as a sort of feature of what I think Russia is doing with this, is that the Holodomor really is a core feature of their larger war, that is Russia's war against Ukraine. And it's a key historical moment in all of this, that Russia continues to distort through disinformation campaigns to really advance their claims that Russia and Ukraine share a common past. And so that's what I'll be speaking about today. So the fire hose of falsehoods method is not my own. This is a term that I have borrowed from Christopher Paul and Miriam Matthews, who have described this sort of tactic that Russia has engaged in, not just with regard to the Holodomor, but with a number of sort of, let's call them media campaigns, in which they're sort of pumping out information about Ukraine that, of course, is false and inaccurate. And really what this does, the way that this sort of plays out, is that Russian propaganda utilizes then a number of sort of outlets and mediums to disseminate just large amounts, large swaths of information that can consist of partial truths, sometimes whole truths, but not not often. Most of the time, they're blatant lies, and all of these messages together. So there's a number of different types of messages. They lack a consistency in messaging and narrative, meaning that you could look to one Russian outlet and they'll give you a false history of the Holodomor, and then you can look to another Russian outlet and they too will give you a false history of the Holodomor, but it's based on a completely different set of beliefs and principles and ideologies. And what this does is it really sort of makes things very difficult for a non-expert to understand about the famine. One only need to turn to the internet, which I do not advise. Then you start going into the depths of disinformation websites. You read, sort of exchanges on sites like Reddit, in which, the everyday Joes are trying to understand. They want real history. They want to know something about the Holodomor, but they're reading, sort of different takes from competing outlets, sometimes that are discreetly hidden behind a real outlet, but really it's a disinformation campaign by Russia that is targeting the narratives that we consume. And I really want to also thank my students, because we've been talking a lot about this in one of my global issues classes, about how to sort of safely, be a conscious consumer with the information that we're digesting, particularly through social media. So if we look historically, we can understand this sort of fire hose of falsehoods. Just imagine information coming at you full blast in different ways over many decades, with different sort of purposes, right? And I think if we look over the longue durée, right, is this long sort of time span, we can see that the Holodomor denial by Russia has taken many forms. So the one thing that's remained quite consistent, I would argue, is that, of course, it has denied and distorted the history of the famine, right? And the sort of genocidal aspects that go with it, right? The purge of the intelligentsia, destruction of the Ukrainian church, destruction of Ukrainian language and culture, all these sort of things that encompass what we know about this period in the 1930s. But it really has ranged in how they deny it. So, if we look right to the 1930s, people like Maxim Litvinov, there's outright denial to the world, right? We know this. It moves through time, particularly in the late 30s and the 40s, to the Holodomor becoming a Nazi invention, right? Something invented by the Nazis to sort of, push against that of the Soviet Union, particularly in the Second World War. This too, of course, would become a characteristic that would not stay in the 40s, but would reemerge in 2022 when the Russian state leaned into this sort of false narrative of Ukraine being a neo-Nazi state. And I'll talk more about this as well. It's also emerged over time to many sort of propagandists calling the Holodomor a hoax, something that did not exist. And then to the more recent narrative, which has been occupying the Russian sources, from what I can tell, is one that is claiming that the famine, of course, the Holodomor, is not a unique famine. It's not genocidal. It wasn't intentional, but it was one that we can sort of think of as a common tragedy. And this has been the way that has been really sort of sneaky. And I'll talk about some of the speeches and sources that have indicated this since 2014 by labeling the famine a common tragedy, right? It's a way for Russia then to sort of, erode the distinctiveness, the genocidal nature of the Holodomor, and instead make it part of the greater all-Union famine that it sort of sees as something that was, universally experienced. And this is problematic for many reasons. So the three main ways that I'll talk about in my just sort of brief amount of time tonight that Russia employs this information, I think comes down to these. One, of course, we can look to state and social media. So we can look to things like Putin, his men in power, their speeches, but also the state social media, and also proponents of Russian media. They're not always Russian media that parrot these accounts, and we can talk about this. The second way is through pseudo-academic and historical discourse, bringing in people that sort of come across as experts and people who are knowledgeable about this history, but actually who are not, and put forward these sort of crazy ideas that then I would call them fringe. That's a nice way of putting it. But then what propaganda does is it makes those fringe ideas look like the status quo. And this becomes hard to sort of untangle if you don't know what you're looking for. And then there's the sort of more recent disinformation, which is the physical destruction, or what I call disinformation through destruction of Holodomor monuments and memorials in Ukraine. And of course, in the Q&A, if we want to talk about it, I have a theory about where this disinformation is going next and how the Russians are doing this. And I'm starting to see it on Instagram and TikTok. So we can talk about this. So if we go back, I'm quite inspired by what Serhiy Plohy did with his book just a couple of years ago in 2023, The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, in which he sort of sat down, and I've been fortunate enough to, talk with him about this at different periods. And he revisited, sort of Russian imperial thinkers, particularly in the 19th century. And what he found is that Putin was relying and sort of reading about these, sort of imperialists and their expansion of the Russian Empire. And it's something that Putin, during COVID lockdown, became rather obsessed with. And by doing this, I think that Serhiy did something very, he wrote a wonderful book that everybody should read. But what he sort of, found for us was that there was some looking to the past in order to understand how we got to where we are today. And so I was inspired by this sort of historical methodology, one might call it, the historian's craft, to go back to the start of Russia's invasion in 2014 and get a sense of what they were doing between 2014 and 2021, leading right up to the full-scale invasion, to sort of get, I wanted to understand, were they talking about the famine, and how so? How are they denying it? And it turns out, of course, that the famine featured in nearly every major speech and on a number of social media campaigns. And so there were hints already that they were working to deny the history of the Holodomor, not only because they don't want the criticism leveled against, what the Soviets did to Ukraine, but it's also a way then of, again, stripping Ukraine of this sort of uniqueness with the Holodomor, right? This intense period of starvation, particularly in late 32 to the, summer of 33, in which Ukraine suffers immensely. And it's a way then to sort of equalize Russia and Ukraine and articulate a vision of them of having a sort of shared famine experience. Now, one of the first instances of this that we can turn to are some remarks made by Gennady Gatilov, who is Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations office. He responded to a UN adopted measure in 2014, which was a global effort. If you know anything about the UN, they have these big sort of advocacy platforms in which they try to solve global issues. And one of the global issues they were trying to solve in 2014 was what they called the rise of Nazism and neo-Nazism and xenophobia. And Gatilov gave a sort of, he gave some remarks and then started talking to the media about this. And for different reasons, the US and Ukraine and a couple of other people or a couple of other countries did not sign this because they saw sort of dubious aims behind Russia's signing of it. And as a result of Ukraine not signing this. I mean, Gatilov first criticizes the United States, but then if you read his sort of segments to the media and his remarks, he sort of details in on Ukraine. And one of the things he does right away is he equates Ukraine not combating neo-Nazism to the rise of Nazism in Ukraine, which is a sort of tired trope that Russia has been trying to play for many years now, and one that hopefully the world is not buying, but it still is there. But if we read beyond that, one of the remarks that Gatilov starts to get into is the history of the Holodomor, and he starts talking about it as a common past, a shared tragedy, and how what Ukraine was doing by talking about the Holodomor and installing monuments and putting it into their sort of legislation and stuff like this, it was Ukraine then that was falsifying history. So they turned the tables immediately through this sort of disinformation narrative. We see it again, too, in 2021 when Putin gives his now infamous speech on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, of which thankfully there was a large pushback by scholars of Ukraine almost immediately that sort of took his argument apart, detail by detail, and proved that, Putin is quite a bad historian. And his speech, too, though, also mentions the Holodomor. And if you go back and read it, he refers back to the 1930s, again, as this common tragedy, as they use it in Russian, the Obshaya Tragedia. And this is, the same language that they'll start to use, the common tragedy. And this, too, is not just a way to deny the Holodomor, but to link Ukraine and Russia through these moments in history. So I took what Plohi did and sort of did it on a micro level, trying to understand how these specific historical events are used in Russia's war against Ukraine. So we see a sort of narrative that is similar from 2014 all the way through 2021. Now, the social media campaigns are another aspect in which, of course, the Holodomor is targeted. Of course, on main sites like RIA Novosti and TASS and RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik. You can see some examples. I just screenshotted them and had them translated into English, the ones that were in Russian. That you can see the way in which the campaigns by these outlets that are, of course, supported by Russian state money or influenced by the Russian state. And of course, there are just dozens of examples, and I talk about them in the chapter I write, but these are some. You have these headlines that sort of give you insight here, right? How Ukraine distorts the history of a tragic Soviet famine to help build its modern national myth. So therefore now the famine is a myth. And this comes from 2023. So this one is more recent. There's, of course, the sort of, I think, in the scholarly circles, the infamous article on Sputnik, which is by Katarina Blunova, who goes into a long sort of diatribe that the Holodomor is a hoax, and of course, a crime under Stalin that never took place. So the sort of, again, relying on the sort of fringe opinions of pseudo-academics, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then two, to give you other examples, if you're on Twitter, which I don't recommend, or Facebook, if you follow any of the Russian Foreign Ministry pages, it doesn't matter. I saw a recent one, I think just from last year. I was looking at it today, the Russian sort of ministry or embassy in New Zealand. They all post similar things. And this one's from 2018, using a constructed map of their own to sort of show where the famine hits across Soviet Union and to try to insinuate that it's not just Ukraine who suffers. And they too, if you look closely, they use their sort of term of common tragedy, in which they sort of indicate again that this is something that is not limited to Ukraine, and that therefore we cannot have a Holodomor or sort of intentional death by starvation or murder by starvation. This is something that other people also suffered from as well. And so the Russian social media campaign, the media and the social media is widespread. And this too becomes a sort of talking point for people who are looking for information about the famine. But, if you're not an expert, you might not understand that RT or Sputnik or some of these, Facebook pages, which exist too in the world of more truthful and accurate media, people may not know that these, they're parroting Kremlin talking points. This is something too that we have to be mindful of. Now, one of the other aspects that they use to sort of form these disinformation narratives, so you get a sense now, right, of it's state media, it's regular media, it's social media, so all these different things coming out of this fire hose, right, spitting the falsehoods. There's also a huge academic discreditation of the Holodomor that goes back, I mean, really through time, but there is a couple of moments that I want to point to give you some sense I think we can go back to the sort of earlier 2000s, 2007, 2008, in which there's, the famine in the USSR. That it's a major work that's sort of taken under careful consideration and really under the careful watch of the Russian Ministry of Culture and Mass Communications. There are different teams of scholars from Russia and Ukraine that are working on this sort of volume. And the Russian team is led by the scholar Viktor Kondrashin, who, I looked into the sort of history of this, and of course, what they're encouraged to do and really forced to do is to go into the archives and find documents about the famine, but they have to be selective, right? There's a sort of archival purge that happens in the 30s and 40s, so much of the documents about the famine is already gone right after the famine sort of takes place, but there's still a number of documents that are quite valuable that scholars go, look for. And so the different teams across different republics, are only allowed to compile documents that, insinuate that there was not a Holodomor in Ukraine, but there was a sort of universal common tragedy. So they've been, sort of purposefully instigating this narrative since 2007, 2008. But, it's worth noting that this doesn't just appear out of thin air, right? There's a number of sort of legislative policies going on in Ukraine as well about, the integration of how we sort of remember the Holodomor. But there's also a really important book that's published in 2007 by a man named Vasyl Marochko, who talks about, the Holodomor as the genocide of Ukrainians. And we can see the sort of work on the book in 2007, 2008, right? The Golod, the famine in USSR, as a response that targets Morochko's text to sort of, downplay what was going on. And of course, Morochko's text is banned in Russia in 2011, and it's labeled as an extremist material. And actually, the publication of his book has been in several libraries in occupied Ukraine, and librarians and others who have been involved in having these books on shelves in places like Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk have been targeted for housing extremist material during the war. So the legacy of 2007 is right in the present as well. Now, the other feature of this is if you start reading the news and the social media, the articles that talk about discrediting the Holodomor really rely on what they call credible authors. Now, if you look closely at a lot of these authors, you can see that these are not scholars of the Soviet Union, of the famine, of the Holodomor, of Ukraine, or anything like this. They are sort of fringe scholars. I'm going to use that term today, fringe, people that can have these opinions, but they're not, they're not shared by a majority of the scholars who work on this. One of these individuals is Grover Furr. Some of you maybe have heard his name, works at Montclair State University in New Jersey. He is a professor of medieval literature, but has gone on to sort of tell blatant lies about the history of the Soviet Union. So even though he's not a specialist in any of this sort of, history or this time period at all, he has these sort of fringe ideas that are really not accepted by the scholarly community, but they are ones that make it into the Russian news sources. So that was that problem I was talking about earlier, is when you take these fringe sort of perspectives and then center them in a news article, it makes it look like the normal perspective. So he's written books with ridiculous titles like Blood Lies, the evidence that every accusation against Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union and Tim Snyder's Bloodlands is false. This builds on earlier works like Douglas Toddle's, which of course is influenced by the Soviet Union, which is, fraud, fascism, and famine, the myth of the Holodomor to Harvard. I forget the exact title, but it's this, again, another erroneous sort of take trying to discredit real scholarship. And there are more recent articles in outlets like RT that are using these sort of pseudo-academics, people that actually don't have academic credentials, but if we look into who they are, they're sort of hard to trace. And they are now spinning narratives. The more recent ones that I've seen is that the Holodomor is a myth that arose in the turbulent 90s in Ukraine after independence, because Ukrainians were dealing with such economic hardship that they then felt a need to blame Russia for what was going on. Therefore, they invented the Holodomor. And the more recent ones now are blaming the CIA during the Cold War as the propagators of the Holodomor myth. So again, all these different perspectives that differ, but all of them that deny the specificity of the Holodomor. And the last point that I'll sort of make here is, we can see disinformation in physical ways too. It's not just in the media or in academic discourse, but through the destruction of monuments. This image here, as I was finishing my dissertation in 2023, was I watched this take place in Mariupol, which, of course, if you followed what happened there, is another horrific tragedy. What the Russian occupiers have done now in the territories that they are in Donbass and in Kherson and in Zaporizhia and other places, is they're going after the monuments and memorials to the Holodomor as well. So they're not only, talking about them being false communicators of false history. This is what the Russians claim. They're actually demolishing this. So they took this one apart in Mariupol and they ground up the materials and used it to construct new housing buildings or something nearby. So they completely repurposed it. And these images too show some local Holodomor memorials and monuments in different parts of Ukraine. Down here, they're taking sledgehammers, to these plaques. They're removing these plaques and this kind of thing. And these are just some of them that we know. The Kharkiv Human Rights Group has been tracking these, but inevitably there are more that have been destroyed that we know nothing about. This is something that Zhenya Monastersky and I wrote an article about the destruction of monuments in Luhansk and how this has a long history as well. So just to conclude here, I've probably taken up too much time, but I want to point out that the disinformation about the Holodomor has existed, straight from the 1930s, almost right away, but it's continued on to today, but taken very different forms. It's transitioned from outright denial to, again, this Nazi invention, which again has served a purpose during the full-scale invasion, to this common tragedy narrative that we have today. And, the reason I decided to talk about this tonight is that we are in November, the official Holodomor commemoration month. And each year, Russia always sort of ramps up their targeting of the Holodomor during this month in their outlets. So I expect a number of sort of articles to be published soon, and maybe I've missed some that have already been published this year, but they will attack the history of the Holodomor. So I sort of see this not as an academic exercise tonight, but also one as sort of, this is a rebuttal back. We are confronting as a group tonight, talking about this, the erroneous claims and the falsifications of history that Russia is pushing. And I think that this is super important. So I think too, understanding this is not just an academic or a public exercise, it's a social good. But I think too, for our government officials, this is going to help us understand the disinformation tactics and really help us counter these narratives using good, what I would call qualified information and scholarly input. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, John, for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure that it will stimulate lots of questions as well. Our final presentation for this evening is by Daria Mattingly. She is a lecturer at the University of Chichester in the UK, and her research focuses on the Holodomor, collectivization, and the social history of violence, with particular attention to rank-and-file perpetrators and the memory of that violence. She's currently completing a monograph entitled Stalin's Activists, the Rank-and-File Perpetrators of the Holodomor. And as I mentioned, together with John Vsetecka, who just spoke, the two of them are co-editing a volume, The Holodomor in Global Perspective. Daria's work has appeared in leading journals and edited volumes, and it's important to note that she's also a frequent commentator on Ukrainian history and its contemporary resonances in multiple media forums. So the title of her presentation this evening is Stalin's Activists, Rank-and-File Perpetrators of the Holodomor. Please join me in welcoming Daria Mattingly.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to join you today. And it is always a privilege to talk about one's research. And today I'm going to talk briefly about rank-and-file perpetrators, and I'm going to share my presentation now, but also about what findings and new perspectives I found for myself while researching rank-and-file perpetrators of the Holodomor. So the first slide actually shows quite a famous figure in Soviet history, obviously the Secretary General of the Communist Party, the leader of the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, all the way until 1982, who is associated with the period of stagnation, but also the period of great fascination in Soviet nostalgia these days. Leonid Brezhnev. But little do we know what he was doing during the Holodomor. And when we are talking about rank and file perpetrators and their later lives, when I was researching them, and that's the first point I'm going to talk about today, I revealed for myself and for the readers of my book, I'm writing about Brezhnev in my book, and it's about to be published. It's coming out next year. I realized the scale of so many different organizations and so many famous people indeed who were involved in the mechanism of the Holodomor. Through various roles and through various actions and different motivations. And when I'm looking at perpetrators more generally, I use overarching typology based on motivation developed by Let's Millers, but also applicable for the Holodomor, and in cooperation with her, we adapted it. There were 6 major motivations: professional, studies and criminals, those who benefited, conformists, ideological participants, and also those who were compromised. And my thesis, my argument in my book is that in the Holodomor, compared to other cases of genocide and cases of mass violence, compromised perpetrators were somewhat a larger group than in other cases. But otherwise, the Holodomor is not an exception in terms of why people perpetrated, committed crime, or participated in mass violence, facilitated the famine, why they did it. We can't blame it on the ideology alone. We can't blame it on profiteering. And of course, without the Kremlin, nothing would have been possible. But what happens on the ground is committed by ordinary people. That's briefly my argument in my book, and I'm following different case studies, and I also look into memory, cultural memory in particular, of the Holodomor and how perpetrators are represented there. And I discovered that there is incongruity about how they are depicted with poetic justice, with some divine providence and so on, and what really happened. So while researching perpetrators, while going to the archives, working in the archives and going to the villages where Kopelev worked or other prominent Stakhanovite, I discovered more nuances and more shocking details about social history of the Holodomor. And point 2 I wanted to make today is about sexualized violence. Or sexual violence or gendered violence. There are different aspects to that violence, but it's not just about female perpetrators or violence against them, but it is also about victims and survival strategies, how people adapted based on their gender, and how also violence, what forms it took during the Holodomor and collectivization, because it all started during collectivization and this habituation to violence, and how it impacted, how it influenced life in the village, and how bodies were controlled, and female bodies in particular, and how it defined life after the famine. And that's why I'm talking about wider impact. And I couldn't escape, I would like to finish on that, but I couldn't escape parallels with the current war, Russo-Ukrainian war. So when we're talking about perpetrators, and this is the picture from Odessa province at the time, now it's Mykolaiv Oblast, but it's Voznesensky district and different villages. In this photo in particular is from ASBO archive, Rechitsky case, and it shows you a brigade that looms large in oral testimonies about the famine, when the brigade comes to the household, to homestead, and digs and prods everything and searches for all food provisions they could find, really. And here you can see even they have a hole in the ground, and they discovered barrels and sacks with some sugar beets and some other foodstuffs. So, but in oral memory of the Holodomor, these perpetrators on the ground, they are depicted as they or as the other. And sometimes, obviously, there are details about local people being involved. But what I would like to focus on today, and here you've got a list of different organizations involved in the famine. State institutions, but also obviously different organizations. So here in the picture on the right, you can see Brezhnev during the Holodomor, and during particular that photo was taken in autumn 1932 or winter 1933. I'm not sure. I couldn't date exactly, but it shows him as the head of a trade union in the Institute of Metallurgy in Kamensk. So it's central Ukraine at the time. He already had some experience of collectivization in Russia proper, in Russian Federation, but then he returned to Ukraine, and in particular during the Holodomor, which covers obviously the late 1932, early 1933, Brezhnev was deployed as the head of the trade union in great procurement in around Kamensk. So right in the middle of Ukraine, he was overseeing some I would say house searches, but also he worked with district officials, and he writes about his experience briefly in his memoir later on. But also from the list, you can see the scope of our different organizations involved that it involved in the Holodomor, including teachers, including collective farmers, different activists, brigade leaders, and so on and so forth. And trade unions were no different. I mean, they were no exception. And here there is another photo, which I also discovered quite by chance, that the father of the Semichyasny, who was the head of KGB in the 1960s, KGB, he was actually working as a local perpetrator, even though he was not local, but on the ground, rank and file perpetrator in Donetsk province during the Holodomor in Udachne, where Max Zhelesnyak, and we have many photos of the period taken by Max Zhelesnyak, and they are used in many works on the Holodomor, and here decolonization, and this photo in particular. I don't know whether Semichyasny's father took part in decolonizing this particular family, and both mother and daughter in this photo survived after the famine, and there are articles written about them and published. But nevertheless, it shows how the system was implicated in the mechanism of the Holodomor, and even Semichyasny's father was on the ground in Donetsk province, in Udachne, when we have photographic footage of decolonization and the time. And obviously, in my book, I write about Stakhanovite. Well, during the Holodomor, they were not Stakhanovites. They were shock workers, but nevertheless, they were really prominent in the village. So we're talking about Pasha Angelina, Maria Demchenko, Marina Ignatenko, Nadia Zahlada, Olesya Kulik, who Pavlo Ticino wrote about, and myself, and others now published articles about Ticino and his involvement in the Holodomor. And in 1933, just as Kopelev left Popivka, and I'm writing about that in my book, Popivka in Myrhorod, so well-known Myrhorod from Orwell's time, from Orwell's works. So Kopelev in December just worked in Myrhorod in Popivka, and he later became a well-known Soviet dissident. And in January, Ticino arrives in Popivka and writes about Stakhanovite Olesya Kulik, one of the first female tractor drivers of the tractors. So in the same village, 2,000 people died as a result of not just what Kopelev did, but also activists like Stahanovets, Olesya Kulik, their actions too, because they were involved in different capacities. And for example, Maria Demchenko writes about how she was searching in the 1970s. She writes in her memoir how she was searching the houses of her fellow villagers and prodding the floor with metal rods. So it's well documented, and it's surprising how it was known and yet silenced in the same time. The interpretation was completely different, why it was needed. And here there is a cover of Oganyok, which is a well-read magazine in the Soviet times in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And it features the picture here is Nadia Zaglada from Zhytomyr Oblast, who actually raised the question that the system, or we collectively, overlooked people on the ground back in the day when we were founding collective farms. So by his open language, she implies that people were overlooked, people died or disappeared, something happened, something was done wrong. And in 1962, she was actually not repentant, but providing a very nuanced reflection about what happened. But majority of the perpetrators did not. And while these ladies were in the 1932-33 perpetrators of violence, they also spoke about the violence perpetrated against women at the time from all sides, and women and children were the most vulnerable. And this is what I discovered as a new perspective of the Holodomor. Sexualized violence took three major forms of obviously rapes and sexual violence, sexual assault, harassment, but also genital mutilation. During lynching, during revenges, and during attacks. And third form was sexual barter or survival prostitution. And I'm writing about that. No, I mentioned that in my book, but there is an article that just came out by Cahiers Russe, it's former name of the famous French journal. So I'm discussing in detail every form of sexual violence that was taking place on the ground from collectivization and was exacerbated by the dire conditions during the Holodomor. And that was experience, that was lived experience, that social history of the Holodomor. And that leads me to my conclusions about new perspectives based on my research. So first and foremost, it's about rank and file perpetrators, that they were ordinary people, but also extraordinary people that the system actually trusted loyal functionaries and those who proved themselves during the trying times of the Holodomor and in Ukraine in particular, such as Brezhnev, such as Semit Chasny, and some of the party elite that actually was implicated in the facilitation of the Holodomor. But also the second point, and I mentioned that, was about sexualized violence and lived experience. And I just stopped sharing my presentation. I just wanted to say concluding words about these new perspectives. And these new perspectives, new findings, if you like, they also tell us about society, how it was shaped and how it was impacted by these forms of violence, sexualized violence, that we find late in the 1980s discussed by the survivors, discussed that there was no justice. Yes, there was a yearning for poetic justice, but otherwise, in the absence of justice, people had to put up with the perpetrators, and sometimes they lived along just side by side, and their children married, and sometimes they did not. And there are many tragic stories about how people coexisted and how conflicts sometimes resulted in further violence, either during World War II or during the Great Purge, the Great Terror in 1930s. And how former victims sometimes would visit the places where they were decolonized and come from Arkhangelsk Oblast to see what happened in the village from which they were deported, and how people accepted that the power relations changed drastically after the Holodomor, and those who perpetrated the Holodomor stayed in the positions of power, not just as the headmasters of the schools or the heads of the village councils, but also they obviously led the party like Brezhnev, and that created a very surreal reality in which there was no justice. There were harsh realities to which you had abide and to which you had not to acquiesce, but accept if you wanted to survive. And that also implied that this compliance and this silence was to stay. However, Ukraine is not Russia, to quote a classic. Now, in the 1980s, we see a complete different situation when actually it reached public discussion during Glasnost and the Holodomor, and all these injustices were articulated. And obviously, it's not part of my research, but we see a different trajectory. And it speaks to what John was just mentioning about this disinformation and myth. And indeed, some historians say that they interpret the Holodomor as an invented tradition, as a myth, and as a political project, whereas social history completely disproves that. It is a lived experience, it is a trauma, and it is social history that is a new perspective to shift our focus and our understanding, and how people made sense of their relationship with the state and their position in these power relations. And Iryna, myself, and Artem are writing an article about it, and but I'm not going to give any spoilers just yet. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Daria, very much for your presentation. I would encourage our members of our audience to please place their questions in the Q&A, but we already have several there, so perhaps we'll just begin. I wanted to begin with the first from Oleg Volovina, and I apologize if I have mispronounced your name. And I would like to combine my question with his, if I may. He, of course, like myself and many others, were really taken with your exploration of the famine as a multi-species catastrophe. The second you present your kind of material, it becomes abundantly obvious that there's enormous merit to such perspectives. And Oleg is asking if who else has has studied this idea of the Holodomor as a multi-species catastrophe. And I would tag on my question to it in that I'm not certain there are so many people that have studied it, but I would certainly leave that to you to answer. But for you personally, I'm wondering, what was it that alerted you to the multi-species dimension of the Holodomor? I asked this question because I'm myself doing research on the experience of the current war and how different kinds of animals are experiencing it. And speaking about companion animals, you spoke about dogs. The second you think that way, you realize that, for example, one of the most discriminatory measures against Jews during World War II was to take their pets away. And one of the most rushed to public measures to defend in the population in the UK was to insist that people volunteer to euthanize their pets so that there would be more food for the general population, and so on and so on. And so I'm wondering, what was it that that piqued your interest about thinking of the Holodomor as a multi-species catastrophe, and who else is looking into that?
Thank you so much, Oleg and Catherine, for such questions, and really like my opportunity to tell more about this idea. And it was developing as every idea, like kind of from one research to another, I think. And in my case, I started looking at oral testimony that are major source of my research, of my book on forthcoming book on survival practices during the Soviet famines, and looking at the multiple examples when people are saying literally that nature saved them from starvation, and numerous cases when this and that animal was very helpful for this and that family. I like it would not be possible that to unnotice this pattern if you start noticing this. And I started working on the chapter on animals during the famines, and was trying to write it as a article or like a chapter, and telling more about like the impact of famine on animals, and trying to see the space for their agency. But then by the end of my work on this chapter and article that is going to come up later this year or next year at East West, there is a volume on anthropological and environmental approaches to environmental studies, edited by Daria and Tanya Richardson. So while talking to them, they encouraged me to see more than just agency. And from this perspective, I started noticing animal-sensitive histories, because like looking at famines, actually you don't see there's too much agency of animals here, because they are mostly subjugated to the human will or to the state will. And from that perspective, like they featured more prominently in my work. And also, I should say that as you already mentioned regarding your work on animals during the current war, I was writing and working on this chapter on animals, particularly during February 2022. So for me, it was also a kind of very decisive moment. I was looking at the chapter on animals and gophers in particular, how they became a source of human survival, and at the same time there were blockade of Mariupol and people were starving, and at the same time there were numerous, like millions and thousands of people crossing Ukrainian border with Poland with pets, cats and dogs. So it was not possible to unnotice the extremity of human and animal sufferings, like and large environmental impact of war and famine. Usually we don't notice it, like if it's not in front of our eyes. That's why I think for me it became an kind of opening kind of moment that I saw that actually it's not only like my way of reading the sources, but it's actually what is happening also during the war. And here I can point out to a brilliant book by Daria that's just published, Ecocide in Ukraine, and where she actually is writing the impact of war on environmental, on multiple animal species. She is not saying that it is multi-species history of the war, but she is writing about land, she's writing about animals, she's writing about numerous animal species, air and energy resources and all of that. So it's there are this one particular important example that I can refer responding to like question. But regarding famine studies, I have not seen this approach to be developed in other famines, not only in Ukrainian. There is a scholarship growing up in Indian, like in Bengal famine, on animals and veterinary science, that kind of became my initial spark of inspiration. But hopefully there will be more studies working on this direction. So thank you so much, both.
Thank you. So now we'll go to a question from Andrew Zorokovsky, and this is in general to anyone who would like to respond. Have any of you considered the presumable contrast in philosophical attitudes toward nature between the Soviet functionaries or activists which presumably reflects a materialist worldview, and the Ukrainian farmers. Has anybody noticed that kind of a contrast?
I would like to answer that question if that's okay. No? In novels and drama, some plays and poetry created out of the famine, about the famine, there is a trope in depiction of how to depict how farmers, Ukrainian farmers and peasants were depicted in contrast to the activists. So there is this trope of the other. The activists are the Mongols, the horde that invaded Ukrainians, and they are raping Ukrainian countryside. Then there is a trope of in Soviet, so that the first trope usually could be found in novels created in diaspora and in independent Ukraine after 1991. In the novels created by Soviet poets and writers, we have the trope of backward, feminine, so effeminated Ukrainian countryside, very dark, very passive, that needs to be plowed, that needs to be inseminated. And activists are representative of virility, very in line with Italian fascist novels and how this passive population is depicted. So there is this trope. And then there is Yevhen Hutsala, Vasily Grossman, and others. Then minority, Samvedov, Tamvedov, who provide more nuanced reading, that there were different people and nobody should be described. Obviously, there is right and wrong, but there is no such brush strokes in depicting either side. So there is more nuanced understanding. That's how I would answer that question. Thank you.
And Iryna, did you want to add anything to that?
I think I can add briefly that, like, in general, like, we can see the major difference between ideological perceptions of materialist culture in Soviet Union that were supposed to be minimal, and at the same time, when it comes to reality, the reality was about scarcity, about shortages, and that's why we can see this contradiction. And in also, like, this partly relates to my research when I'm writing that actually it was material objects that helped people also to survive, became a major resource of their survival. Certainly for those who have something to sell, like jewelry, like earrings, like golden wedding rings. But at the same time, this was fully, like, contradicting the idea of Soviet ideology that it was against any excessive consumption. So this kind of, like, this in philosophical, like, meaning, this was fully, like, two different kind of worlds: the reality and ideology of Soviet early Soviet society of the time.
We have a question now for John. Thank you, Iryna. As part of state-sponsored propaganda and disinformation, how did the narrative in Russian history books change after February 22 concerning the famine of 1932-33?
Yeah, thank you, Edward, that's a great question. I've been staring at that since you wrote it because the honest answer is I'm not completely sure. I haven't had a chance to look at a lot of the textbooks since 2022. I've been occupied with other things as this is not the sort of main trajectory of my research. But when writing this piece, I did read some of the textbooks, the Russian textbooks, particularly at like the sort of middle school, high school level, that talk about the famine as a common tragedy. So they've sort of interpreted this whole war narrative or the historical war narrative of the famine as something that is shared between Russia and Ukraine. But they've gone a step further in what I've seen too, in the fact now they're being a little bit more aggressive toward the history of the Holodomor. They use these sort of terms as so-called. You see this a lot in the books, or alleged. Everything's in quotes to sort of make it like it's not a real thing that happened, that it's invented. They use the words, of course, it's a nationalist trope that's attributed to OUN and UPA. They've doubled down. I think the big change from what I've seen so far, and I need to look at more books when I can get my hands on them, not always an easy thing to do in Russia right now, is that they've linked the production of the Holodomor myth, as they call it, to the rise of a neo-Nazi state in Ukraine. And to do this since 2022 has allowed then the Russian narrative to sort of push that propaganda and this disinformation on a younger population, because then if they're reading that, look, this is what, the Ukrainians are, they turn the narrative. It's now that Ukraine is perpetrating disinformation about the 1930s, and it correlates to the rise of neo-Nazism. Then you're telling these young Russian students that we have to fight this. So it's been a more aggressive take from what I know so far. And that's the best answer that I can give you at this point.
Okay, thank you, John. Now we have another question for Daria from Olena Nikolaenko, and this has to do with the perpetrators. Can you give us a sense as to the number of perpetrators you're talking about, and give us a sense as to the socio-demographic characteristics of these perpetrators?
Quickly about the numbers. I do not have the exact number of the perpetrators, but we are talking about hundreds of thousands. For example, Tso Aviahim in summer 1933 provided 20,000 members to guard the fields from those who would go in and pilfer or glean or hairdressers. So we're talking about the starving children and their parents going into the fields to take some ears of wheat before of the new harvest, and 20,000 young men and women were guarding. We're talking about teachers, and it's 40,000, over 40,000 women and men, 1932-33 during the Holodomor, who assisted the searchers, accounting and different logistics of the grain requisitions. And so many state organizations were involved. So we're definitely, I would dare to say, up to 1 million people were involved in that mechanism. Socio-demographic characteristics, the profile would be, most of them would be men, young. So we're talking about conflict of generations as well, to a degree. But it depends if it was somebody collecting the bodies of the deceased, those who died, then would we call them perpetrators or not? So, but when we're talking about village activists, it's certainly majority of them were men. They were local perpetrators who were plenipotentiaries sent from the cities or or workers. 25,000. There were only 7,000 of them in Ukraine, and they were from Ukrainian cities, Kharkiv, Kyiv, and other cities. Workers and urbanites were in the minority. Over 95% of them were young men with little education, so primary education at best, and they were local, and they stayed in the village after the famine. That would be, and when it comes to ethnic representation, I would say even on the district level, if I'm not talking about GPU or militia, they were representative of the ethnic makeup of the republic at the time. So we have ordinary people.
Okay, thank you. So here's a general question to everybody, and it's from Dmitry Boshko. This is a question about the consequences that the Holodomor might have yielded in terms of an absence of cross-generational artifacts for those families who experienced the Holodomor. I wonder if anybody has any insight about that.
I may jump in, as this also relates to like materiality as source of famine survival, and the major consequences to that was actually what Dmitro just mentioned. Family lost their heritage, their material belongings that will pass down from generation to generation, and in that case, there were no any more earrings that could be passed down to daughter or granddaughter. So there were not any major valuable belongings that people have to sell during this famine in Turksins. And that's why Holodomor was very particular and very different compared to the first and the third Soviet famine in 1920s and 40s, where state didn't create this specific system of extraction of this golden and resources and jewelry and other valuables. For that reason, also, like when I was working with testimonies of famine survivors, one thing that struck me in particular was actually this massive loss, massive trauma about very small material belongings, like seems to us, but like some ordinary things, but they were still so visually remembered in many various details. That's why it feels like it was significant loss for generations, and was also passed down from one generation to another, because that in the testimonies that I worked with, there were children who were mentioning this things that were lost during the famine by their parents. So it's something that we also have to consider when we are studying famines, and including this also material culture approach, material turn, in order to understand the larger scope of the impact of famine. Thank you so much for allowing to reflect on that question.
So we also, unless there's someone who wants to further that, then I would go, probably this will be our final question. Many people have asked for reading recommendations. So if I could ask each of you to note what for you has been one of the most significant, or in other ways influential, books or articles that you've read on the famine that has influenced your thinking. And Linda Go in particular asked if you could reflect on any differences that you've noticed between books that are written by Ukrainians in Ukraine and also by non-Ukrainian academics. So perhaps, Iryna, can we start with you? And then we'll go to John and Daria.
Well, it's a very hard question. I think there were so many, books written in the recent decade, specifically published by Rek and Kius. And I think for me, the starting point was books about contextualizing the Holodomor, and also a book on colonial Soviet famines, also published both by Rek Press and Kius. And these books helped me a lot, for finding more theoretical approaches to Holodomor in particular. And when it comes to comparison between diaspora publications and published by Ukrainian scholars, I can also highlight there is a book by Australian historian, and she published recently a collection of testimonies of children survivors, children of Holodomor survivors in Australia. That is really something that very important to work with, because it allows us to see this trauma, these experiences that pass down from generation to generation. Her name is Lesa Melnichuk-Morgan, and I recommend to have a look at this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Iryna. How about John?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and a hard one, because there are, a number of books written on the topic. And I think, just to plug my colleagues here, their works are also coming out, and a number of us, and more that are not featured here. So there's a whole new contingent of scholarship that will be out in the next couple of years. So I recommend my colleagues, first and foremost, Iryna and Daria. For me, one of the books that I consistently I would say I point my colleagues to all the time, because I get tired of answering the question of the distinctions between Holodomor and the all-Soviet famine, is Stanislav Kulczycki's The Anatomy of the Holodomor. This is a great text. It's published in English translation by Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Press. And it is a great book that really gets into the sort of intricacies of all the distinguishments that we can make between, the specificities of what happens in Ukraine, and also, what happens in terms of famine in places in part of Russia and in Kazakhstan and elsewhere. So I definitely recommend that. One book, of course, that is integral into my own research that probably has been bent forward and backwards more than any book on my shelf in the past couple of years is the edited volume After the Holodomor, which tackles the sort of short and long-term consequences of the famine, and one of the few books on the topic in English that considers some of these things. I think this is a great book, and one, it was published in 2008 after a conference at Hurry. This is a fantastic book. And then, just to reiterate, some of the work of our Ukrainian colleagues as well, I would recommend the book by Andrei Kozitsky about disinformation on the Holodomor, which, again, it's only in Ukrainian for now. I hope somebody will translate it, but it is a great text on the sort of really longue durée history of this phenomenon.
And Daria, concluding thoughts?
Well, I would be biased because I was a research assistant to Anne Applebaum, but I would recommend Red Famine by Anne Applebaum and also Stalin's War on Ukraine. And there are so many parallels with today's war. I would also recommend Vasily Grossman, Forever Flowing or Everything Flows. And there is a very poignant testimony, and not testimony, it reads as a confession by a perpetrator, female perpetrator, and she's punished by illness for what she did in Ukraine, and she was sent there from Russia. And I followed that. I interviewed Vasily Grossman's daughter, and I found out that the reality was far, far, far away from fiction, and that perpetrator in particular lived a very long and happy life and was remunerated for her participation in the Holodomor and then reporting on Soviet writers and getting them into Gulag and so on and so forth. So it was different, but Vasily Grossman writes well and wrote well, and it influenced me as a researcher.
Thank you. Hopefully that also answers to a degree Edward Baidus's question that was to you as well, which we didn't really get to. But our webinar has come to an end. It's up to me to then thank each of our three participants for very provocative presentations, and I can only wish you continued success and inspiration as you pursue your research on these very, very important themes. Thank you to all of us for joining us this evening, and on December 6th, we'll have our next seminar. I hope to see all of you then. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting.